Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all my brothers and sisters. Welcome to the Roots of Islam channel. Imagine being born into culinary royalty, with the blood of Britain's most legendary chef running through your veins, yet finding yourself behind prison bars, desperate for a way out of a nightmare that had consumed over a decade of your life. This is the shocking story of Marco Pierre White Jr., the 28-year-old son of Marco Pierre White, the youngest chef ever to earn 3 Michelin stars, the man who trained Gordon Ramsay, and one of the most influential figures in modern British cuisine. You'd think growing up with such privilege would guarantee success, but sometimes the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. Junior's story isn't about inheriting his father's culinary genius. It's about a young man who inherited fame, fortune, and access to anything money could buy, yet found himself addicted to heroin by age 13. For 15 years, he lived a double life. The celebrity chef's son in public and a desperate addict in private. By the time he was 28, he had been through rehab 17 times, cost his father over £1 million in treatment, and was facing his darkest hour in a prison cell. But what happened next would shock everyone who knew his story. Marco Pierre White Jr. wasn't supposed to end up this way. Born into a world where celebrity chefs were treated like rock stars and his father's restaurants were destinations for royalty and millionaires, Junior had every advantage imaginable. The media followed his every move, expecting him to follow in his legendary father's footsteps. But the pressure of living up to the White family name became suffocating. While other teenagers worried about homework and dating, Junior was already experimenting with drugs at 13, trying to escape the overwhelming expectations placed on his young shoulders. The restaurant industry that had made his father famous was also notorious for its party culture, and Junior found himself surrounded by temptations that his adolescent mind couldn't handle. What started as teenage rebellion quickly spiraled into something much more dangerous. By 16, he was already in his first rehab facility, beginning what would become a devastating cycle of addiction, treatment, relapse, and despair. The boy who should have been learning knife skills and cooking techniques was instead learning the harsh realities of addiction recovery. Lessons that, tragically, never seemed to stick. The numbers tell a story of heartbreak that money couldn't solve. 17 different rehab facilities. Over £1 million spent on the finest addiction treatment programs available. Countless interventions, therapy sessions, medical detoxes, and family meetings. Marco Pierre White Sr., despite his tough reputation in the kitchen, proved to be a devoted father who would literally spend every penny he had to save his son's life. But addiction is a beast that doesn't care about your bank account or your family's reputation. Each time Junior entered treatment, there was hope that this time would be different. Each time he relapsed, the family's desperation deepened. The media watched with morbid fascination as the celebrity chef's son repeatedly made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Shoplifting incidents, drug possession charges, knife offenses, the list of Junior's crimes grew longer with each passing year. Friends and family watched helplessly as this brilliant young man, with so much potential destroyed every opportunity handed to him. The £1 million spent on treatment wasn't just money. It represented a father's love, a family's hope, and society's best attempt to save someone who seemed determined to self-destruct. By 2022, Marco Pierre White Jr. had hit what seemed like absolute rock bottom. The charges that would land him in prison read like a catalog of desperation: shoplifting, possessing a knife, carrying heroin, and racially aggravated disorderly behavior. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was that even at 28, with nearly 2 decades of addiction behind him, Junior seemed unable to break free from the cycle that was destroying his life. The young man who had once had the world at his feet was now facing a 12-month prison sentence, his relationship with his famous father strained to the breaking point. The media coverage was brutal, with headlines focusing on his failures rather than the underlying tragedy of addiction. As he entered prison, Junior later admitted that he felt hopeless. Every treatment program had failed, every intervention had been temporary, every promise to get clean had been broken. He was no longer the celebrity chef's son with potential. He was just another addict facing the consequences of his choices. Little did anyone know that this seemingly final chapter of his downward spiral was actually about to become the prologue to the most dramatic transformation of his life. Something extraordinary began to happen during Junior's time in prison. Something that 17 rehab programs and £1 million in treatment hadn't been able to achieve. As he watched Muslim inmates prepare for their daily prayers, Junior found himself curious about their dedication and the obvious peace they seemed to find in their faith. "In prison, I saw the lads going to pray," he later revealed in an exclusive interview. These weren't the kind of people Junior had expected to be drawn to. They came from all walks of life, different backgrounds and cultures, yet they shared something that intrigued him. Unlike the forced positivity of rehab programs or the clinical atmosphere of treatment centers, there was something authentic about the way these men approached their faith. They weren't trying to sell him anything or convince him of anything. They were simply living their beliefs in the most challenging environment imaginable. Junior began asking questions, not because anyone was pressuring him, but because he genuinely wanted to understand what gave these men such strength and purpose. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next fix or his next scheme. He was thinking about something bigger than himself. It started with curiosity, but it became a revelation that would transform Junior's life forever. During long prison nights, when sleep wouldn't come and the reality of his wasted years felt overwhelming, Junior began reading the Quran. What he discovered wasn't what he expected from a religious text. Instead of archaic language and outdated concepts, he found practical wisdom about life, relationships, purpose, and most importantly for someone in his situation, redemption and second chances. The Quran spoke directly to his condition as someone who had fallen repeatedly but wasn't beyond hope. Unlike the temporary motivation of rehab programs that focused on behavior modification, Islamic teachings addressed the spiritual emptiness that Junior now realized had been driving his addictions all along. He began to understand that his problem wasn't just chemical dependency. It was a spiritual crisis that no amount of money or medical treatment could solve. The Islamic concept of surrender to Allah resonated with someone who had tried to control his addiction through willpower and had failed every time. For the first time in his adult life, Junior began to consider that maybe the solution wasn't about becoming stronger. Maybe it was about acknowledging his need for divine help. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was thorough and genuine. Junior spent months in deep conversations with Muslim inmates who became his teachers and guides. These men, many of whom had faced their own struggles with crime and addiction, understood his journey in ways that expensive therapists never had. They didn't judge his past or lecture him about his mistakes. Instead, they shared how Islam had given their own lives meaning and direction. Through these conversations, Junior learned about the 5 pillars of Islam, the importance of daily prayer, the concept of community support, and most importantly, the idea that every person can find redemption through sincere repentance and commitment to positive change. What impressed him most was how these principles weren't just theories. He could see them working in the lives of the men around him. They had found something that all his father's money and all the world's best treatment programs couldn't provide: genuine inner peace and unshakable purpose. By the time Junior made his formal declaration of faith, converting to Islam while still in prison, it wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of months of study, reflection, and spiritual growth. When Marco Pierre White Jr. walked out of prison in 2023, he wasn't the same man who had entered 12 months earlier. The most visible change was his commitment to the 5 daily prayers that Islam requires, a discipline that provided structure to someone whose life had been chaotic for 15 years. More than £1 million has wasted because of my addictions. But Islam has helped me get through everything, he revealed in his first interview after release. This wasn't just another treatment program or another attempt at sobriety. This was a complete reorientation of his entire worldview. The daily prayers became anchor points that grounded him when temptation arose. The Islamic principles of community, charity, and service to others gave him purpose beyond his own recovery. Most importantly, the Islamic concept of tawbah, repentance, provided him with a framework for dealing with guilt and shame that had previously driven him back to drugs. For someone who had failed 17 times in traditional treatment, the success of Islamic spirituality in his life was nothing short of miraculous. His father, Marco Pierre White Sr., supported his son's conversion, recognizing that where money and medicine had failed, faith had succeeded. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the family story. Marco Pierre White Sr. had built his reputation on perfectionism, demanding excellence in every dish that left his kitchen. Now his son was discovering that the secret ingredient missing from his life hadn't been found in any of the world's finest restaurants or most expensive treatment centers. It had been found in the simple act of surrendering to divine will. Junior began to see parallels between his father's culinary discipline and the spiritual discipline that Islam required. Just as a chef must follow recipes precisely to create something beautiful, Junior learned that following Islamic teachings precisely could create something beautiful from the wreckage of his life. The structure that had been imposed on him in rehab had never worked because it was external, but the structure of Islamic practice came from internal conviction and genuine faith. Prayer 5 times a day wasn't a burden. It was a blessing that kept him connected to his purpose. Avoiding alcohol and drugs wasn't a restriction. It was a liberation from the substances that had enslaved him for 15 years. For the first time, Junior understood that true freedom came not from doing whatever he wanted, but from choosing to do what was right. Perhaps no one was more amazed by Junior's transformation than his father, Marco Pierre White Sr., the legendary chef who had conquered the culinary world but had been powerless to save his son from addiction, watched in wonder as Islamic faith accomplished what all his money and influence couldn't. The man known for his fiery temper and perfectionist standards found himself learning about patience and acceptance from his converted son. Junior's newfound peace and purpose began to heal not just his own life, but his relationship with his family. The chaos and heartbreak that had defined their relationship for over a decade was replaced by meaningful conversations about faith, purpose, and redemption. Marco Sr., while not converting himself, developed a deep respect for the religion that had saved his son's life. He began to understand that the discipline he had applied to creating culinary masterpieces was similar to the spiritual discipline that Islam brought to Junior's daily life. The father who had spent over £1 million on failed treatments watched his son find priceless healing through prayer and community support that cost nothing but sincerity. Junior's story began attracting attention not just from a media that had chronicled his failures, but from addiction specialists and spiritual leaders who were amazed by his transformation. Here was someone who had failed in every conventional treatment program available, yet had found lasting sobriety through Islamic faith. His conversion became a case study in how spiritual solutions could address problems that medical and psychological approaches had failed to solve. Junior himself expressed a desire to follow in his father's footsteps, but with a difference. He wanted to become a chef who could serve both food and hope to people struggling with addiction. His story resonated with Muslim communities around the world, who saw in him proof that Islam could transform even the most seemingly hopeless situations. But it also intrigued non-Muslim audiences who were curious about what exactly Islam offered that other approaches didn't. Junior's interviews and public appearances became opportunities to share not just his personal story, but the practical benefits of Islamic lifestyle and spiritual practices for anyone seeking positive change. One of the most significant differences Junior discovered between his previous attempts at recovery and his Islamic transformation was the role of community. In rehab, he had been surrounded by other addicts in various stages of recovery and relapse, creating an environment where success was uncertain and temporary. In the Muslim community, he found himself surrounded by people committed to lifelong spiritual growth and mutual support. The Islamic concept of Ummah, the worldwide community of believers, meant that Junior wasn't just recovering alone. He was part of a global family committed to helping each other live righteously. Friday prayers at the mosque provided weekly community connection, while daily prayers provided constant spiritual grounding. The charity requirements of Islam gave him opportunities to help others, shifting his focus from self-obsession to service. Perhaps most importantly, the Islamic prohibition on alcohol and drugs wasn't just a personal choice. It was a community value that everyone around him shared and supported. For someone who had grown up in the celebrity world where substance abuse was often normalized and enabled, finding a community that celebrated sobriety was revolutionary. What Junior discovered through experience, researchers were beginning to understand through science. Studies on addiction recovery increasingly showed that spiritual approaches often succeeded where purely medical or psychological treatments failed, particularly for long-term sobriety. The structure of Islamic practice, 5 daily prayers, weekly community gatherings, annual fasting during Ramadan, and lifetime commitment to ethical living, provided exactly the kind of comprehensive lifestyle change that addiction specialists now recognize as crucial for lasting recovery. The Islamic emphasis on tawbah, repentance, and Allah's mercy offered psychological benefits for dealing with guilt and shame that often trigger relapses. The prohibition on intoxicants wasn't just a rule. It was part of a complete worldview that valued clarity of mind and spiritual awareness over temporary escape from reality. Junior's success wasn't just about finding religion. It was about finding a comprehensive system that addressed the spiritual, psychological, social, and practical aspects of addiction recovery. His story became evidence that sometimes the most effective treatment isn't found in the most expensive facilities, but in ancient wisdom that has been helping people transform their lives for over 14 centuries. The media that had once chronicled Junior's arrests and relapses now found themselves covering a completely different story, one of genuine transformation and hope. His conversion to Islam represented more than personal recovery. It challenged common assumptions about addiction, treatment, and the role of faith in healing. Speaking candidly about his journey, Junior acknowledged that his 17 failed rehab attempts hadn't been complete failures. They had each taught him something about himself and prepared him to recognize the solution when he finally found it in Islam. His story began inspiring other families struggling with addiction, showing them that hope remained even after conventional treatments had failed. Muslim communities embraced him as a powerful example of Islam's transformative power, while addiction recovery communities studied his case for insights into alternative approaches to treatment. Junior's transformation from celebrity chef's troubled son to inspiring example of Islamic conversion demonstrated that no one is too far gone for redemption. His story proved that sometimes the most powerful changes come not from trying harder, but from surrendering to something greater than ourselves. Today, Marco Pierre White Jr. represents something that seemed impossible just a few years ago. Proof that genuine transformation is possible even after repeated failures. His conversion to Islam didn't just end his addiction. It gave his entire life new meaning and direction. The young man who had once cost his family over £1 million in failed treatments was now using his story to help others find the priceless gift of spiritual healing. His daily prayers provided the structure that rehab programs couldn't. His faith community offered the support that celebrity connections never had, and his relationship with Allah gave him the purpose that fame and fortune couldn't supply. Junior's story challenges everyone, believers and non-believers alike, to consider what really provides lasting change in human lives. Is it money, medicine, willpower, or something deeper? His journey from the depths of addiction to the heights of spiritual transformation suggests that sometimes the most powerful healing comes not from human intervention, but from divine mercy available to anyone sincere enough to seek it. The celebrity chef's son had finally found the secret ingredient that had been missing from his life all along, and that ingredient was faith. In the end, Marco Pierre White Jr. discovered that the most important recipe isn't for creating gourmet food, but for creating a meaningful life. And that recipe, he learned, has only one essential ingredient: complete surrender to the will of Allah.